Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this Youth Studies plenary panel entitled Intersectional Perspectives in Youth Research, Promises, Challenges and Possibilities. This plenary interrogates how youth research and knowledge of youth and young people's lives are produced within and across the subdisciplines of sociology. Clearly focused on the future of youth studies, this plenary asks how we can better accommodate productive conversations across these subdisciplines to better understand the interplay of youth and gender, sexuality, social class, race and ethnicity, disability, migration, and geographic location, as these relate to young people's identities, lived experiences, cultures, and transitions. I'm Dr. Caitlin Nunn from the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'll be chairing the session. I'm joined by panel members Sophie Aberton from the University of Manchester, Benjamin Hankel from the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, Deo Asonu from the University of Manchester, Karenza Moore from the University of Salford, and Tracy Sheldrick from Newcastle University. I'll introduce each of them more fully shortly. The panel builds on a workshop organised by the Youth Study Group in the pre-COVID era, which itself was a response to a previous BSA conferences, where we found youth studies scholarship was often dispersed across conference streams. This is in many ways a positive thing, reflecting an increasingly intersectional approach to youth studies research that addresses historical blind spots in relation to some of the structures, identities, and cultures that shape young people's lives. At the same time, we are eager to ensure that this intersectional work fosters dialogue within the youth studies community and contributes to the development of the subdiscipline. According to Andy Furlong and Fred Cartmell, youth studies has always been an important site for examining the relevance of new social theories, given the position of young people at the crossroads of the processes of social reproduction. And yet, while youth studies has historically done a good job of attending to certain intersections, notably class, it's done less well in addressing others, in particular the role of race, not only as it relates to the lives of racialized subjects, but as a pervasive form of structural inequality, an issue that Deo will address in her presentation. In addition, there are also at times conceptual roadblocks impeding dialogue across subdisciplines, such as where different discourses are used to speak about young people, as Benjamin will discuss in relation to youth health research. Also, where shared concepts have different applications. For example, in the field of migration studies, we think with concepts that include culture and generations, but in much different ways to how they are applied in youth studies, and with insufficient attention paid in both fields to how these different cultures and generations intersect in the lives of migrant background young people. Attending to the complexity and diversity of youth identities and experiences is increasingly urgent in the context of contemporary intersecting crises that are disproportionately affecting young people. In the face of a decade of austerity, the COVID-19 pandemic, Brexit, the climate crisis, and Black Lives Matter, it is critical that we place youth studies in dialogue with other branches of sociology and cognate disciplines. This will ensure that we are using all of the theoretical and epistemological tools at our disposal to best understand and serve the needs, interests, and aspirations of young people. And so we offer this plenary as an invitation and a provocation to both youth studies scholars and to other sociologists and social scientists whose research engages with young people. We have 4 panelists in today's session, with Professor Tracy Sheldrick as respondent. Our panel is comprised of scholars from across career stages who each approach youth studies from different subdisciplinary perspectives. Each panelist will take around 5 minutes to briefly introduce their work and reflect on their navigation across sociological subdisciplines. They will highlight the opportunities and challenges intersectional research presents for youth studies and for knowledge of youth and young people's lives. Tracy will then take 10 minutes to respond to the panelists, reflect on her own research, and draw on her extensive knowledge and experience in the subdiscipline to identify promises, challenges, and possibilities for a more intersectional youth studies. We then look forward to a discussion with all of you and the opportunity to hear your ideas and experiences. I'll introduce all of the speakers now, rather than complicate the recording process by doing so before each speaker. So up first, we have Sophie Aberton, who was a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Manchester. Her research focuses on the experiences and representation of transgender and non-binary students in secondary schools in the UK and provisions for the future. Through this, she primarily engages with youth studies, the sociology of education, trans studies, and the sociology of gender and sexuality. Dr. Benjamin Hankel is up next. Benjamin is a sociologist at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. His research examines youth health and well-being, social inequalities in health, and social change. His recent work has examined digital technologies for health, the digital practices of young people, as well as public health intervention implementation. Deo Isonu is our third speaker. Deo has recently submitted her doctoral thesis in politics at the University of Manchester. She researches the inclusion of marginalised groups, focusing on designing public participation practices to include non-white young people in public service design and delivery. And our final panellist is Dr. Carenza Moore. Carenza currently lectures at the University of Salford. She has researched young people's drug use for 17 years, with a focus on recreational spaces such as raves, nightclubs, festivals, and house parties. Trained as a medical sociologist, much of Carenza's work intersects with subdisciplines also concerned with drugs, including alcohol and drug studies, criminology, and youth studies. And finally, our respondent is Professor Tracy Sheldrick. Tracy is Professor of Inequalities and Head of Sociology at Newcastle University, and Co-Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Youth Studies. Tracy's research has a focus on young people and particularly youth transitions. She is interested in issues around employment, low pay, and welfare reform, and has a special interest in the northeast of England, where much of her research is based. And so I'll now hand over to our panellists, and I hope you enjoyed the session.
So as Caitlin said, my name is Sophie Aberton and I'm a PhD student at the University of Manchester, and my research topic is about the experiences of trans and non-binary youth in secondary school in the UK. And I'm going to kick off the panel today by talking about intersecting crisis for LGBT youth, in particular trans and non-binary youth. So firstly, why LGBT youth? LGBT youth are affected by a number of intersecting crises, both before and during and possibly after COVID-19. And briefly, I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. So firstly, statistics from the Albert Kennedy Trust show that 24% of homeless people identify as LGBT. So that's nearly a quarter of all homeless people are LGBT. And thinking about this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, young LGBT people might not be able to stay at home, as was advised by the government. And in cases where they can stay at home, they might not feel safe to do so. So they might be facing transphobia, homophobia, or rejection from their parents. And whilst this might seem like a very bleak picture, there are some signs of hope that I've seen during the pandemic anyway. Despite being subjected to years of cuts and minimum government funding over recent years, during COVID-19, many charities and organisations have been continuing the really great work that started before the pandemic, and have been running support services online and holding virtual events for LGBT youth. So, for example, I know Gender Intelligence have a lot of things on their website, a lot of tools and resources, and so do the Proud Trust, who are based in Manchester. But by highlighting the crises above, so COVID, homelessness, austerity, loneliness, transphobia, homophobia, and racism, I just wanted to point out that LGBT youth can experience a variety of intersecting crises, and these are all sort of going on at once. And why trans and non-binary youth in particular? So much research has focused on the experiences of LGBT youth as a whole. But the term LGBT represents lots of very different groups of people who sometimes don't all have the same needs or face the same injustices, and don't all experience crises in the same way. So in particular, there is very little research on trans and non-binary youth and the specific experiences that they have. And they are facing currently at this moment very specific concerns. And a couple of them relate to the Gender Recognition Act and the Gender Identity Clinic. So recently in the UK, the Gender Recognition Act was planned to be reformed, and apart from a few modernisations, Stonewall have issued a statement saying that there's very little change to the process itself. And there's also really long waiting times at the Gender Identity Clinic. So according to the LGBT Foundation 2020, the waiting list is currently at 1.5 years, and that completely exceeds the NHS guideline of 18 weeks. And although most of this does apply to people over the age of 18, because youth are even more marginalised and can't access these services anyway, it still shows the specific issues that they do face compared to LGBT youth as a whole. So yeah, it's a very, very bleak picture for LGBT youth at this current time. But I think, how can youth studies help us to understand their experiences better? And I think youth studies invites us to think beyond adults. So trans studies is very largely focused on the experiences of adults and beyond the specific site of school, which is what the sociology of education looks at. Youth studies recognises young people's ability to exert agency. So what are young trans people doing to work around the limitations imposed on them by healthcare? Young trans people still exist despite the marginalisation that they face. And even though youth studies does look at LGBT as a whole, it does offer opportunities and inspiration for looking at different groups of young people. For example, the work on subcultures in youth studies, it again draws on this broader idea that there are different groups of young people with different experiences. So overall, I think youth studies encourages us to think about the particular experiences of young people. And here, I hope I've drawn attention to the need to pay particular attention to different groups of young people within the LGBTQ+ rainbow. Thank you everyone for listening.
Hi everyone, my name's Ben. I'd like to thank Caitlin for the introduction. So my work sits at the intersection of health research and youth sociology. I want to, in thinking through, I guess, intersections and crises, I want to discuss 3 points today, at which health as a discipline and youth sociology for me intersect. I believe these 3 points represent critical ongoing debates and tensions between the two disciplines. And I want to think through the emerging possibilities that are taking place, particularly in thinking with and within crises, as well as productive ways forwards for us as researchers at this critical intersection. The first point I want to make today is about the dominance of the youth at risk, or the risky youth models. Turnbull and Spence in 2011 argued that whilst youth have always been positioned as a problem throughout history, the recent and ongoing focus on youth as risk or at risk in late modernity has extended from such fields as public health to dominate youth social policy more broadly. Turnbull and Spence suggest that this not only turns growing up into a problem to be solved, but also reflects a society that fears its own future, perhaps more now than ever. Youth, thus, because of their risky behaviours, become seen as a key site for health interventions to take place. Such models of risk are limiting in that they often start by framing young people at risk, risky, or engaging in problematic behaviours. Consider, for instance, how digital media is often imagined and how young people are often imagined to be using social media sites. In these narratives, risk and harm often get conflated, which often happens in health research. So experiences of risk are imagined always lead to harm. These ideas of risk are important to dwell on because these ontologies frame the behaviours of young people, or at least frame the behaviours we seek and look for, and situate our research projects, and thus often become embedded in research, particularly where research attends to health and well-being. Where risky practices and vulnerability are evident, for instance, in grant applications, ethic applications, and health intervention research more broadly. Youth sociologists have directed us to the agency of young people with a particular focus on subjectivity and lived experiences. And whilst there is more to do here, I believe, particularly as it relates to how risk and vulnerability already get embedded in research projects, sociologists and youth sociologists in particular have to date opened up the possibilities for exploring youth experience more broadly and the different ways risk is experienced in context by surfacing the nuanced experiences and complex practices of young people. A secondary related concern that I have to the idea, I guess, of the risky young person is around the term of resilience, which has emerged in health research, which is really the ability to adapt to circumstances. Health researchers have focused on the potential of enhancing resilience of young people. However, often this is framed as an internal quality, which is often at tension with the way that sociologists kind of think about the world. Emerging research in youth sociology on this line of thinking has questioned the role of resilience and how, outside of being an internal quality, it is situational and shaped and can be supported at the micro and meso level. So by families, schools, communities, and as recent work is kind of suggesting, and including my own, online networks. But as well as that, the policy, media, market, and the state, the ecosystem, which Mu in 2020 suggests all come to shape child and youth resilience. Emerging models in health research have been engaged with by youth sociologists to respond to and talk with health researchers, such as the ecological model, which accounts for these various factors that influence health. Though, as Olson and colleagues have pointed out in 2015, we need to ask if this focus on resilience, and I guess at risk and risky behaviors by extension, can provide pathways for people out of or away from the structural inequalities that make up their lives. And these are important, I guess, concerns that kind of sit at this intersection of health and youth sociology, and more broadly make us question, I guess, the possibilities for addressing some of the problems that young people are experiencing as they face intersecting crises. So this brings me to my final point, I guess, about language and the possibilities for talking between and across these disciplines. And we might come across this a few times today in our discussion. A common issue across sociology and health, and particularly public health, that remains is about how can we talk about problems, because often the language of efficacy and implementation in health collides with, for instance, structural inequalities, agency, and capital, terms we're very familiar with within sociology. This is not to say they cannot work together, but this remains an enduring problem. However, emerging work over the last few years in health research has focused on complexity of systems and how health is made possible across complex contexts. And there's more work to be done, particularly as in regards to young people and youth. But take health interventions, for example. They are complex, they have multiple components, which may interact and may be difficult to delineate from the context and implemented within complex systems. Sociologists, youth sociologists in particular here, have tools and methods to explore these issues with health researchers, and an opportunity emerges, I believe, to find common language or find a middle ground perhaps, and bring our tools together across disciplines. These are a few of the tensions that have stood out to me. Rather than an ending, I think they point to some of the productive possibilities at the intersection of youth sociology and health that aim to ensure young people are supported in the spaces they are in and where they need it, and for this intersection to have positive health and wellbeing outcomes for the young people who need it. Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin, for the introduction and for setting the scene for this panel. Sophie and Ben, it's been quite interesting to kind of listen to you talk, because I can already see, I guess, some of the intersections in the different disciplines, particularly with what I'm interested in when I'm talking about race. So I am probably a sociologist outsider, because my field of study is public administration, but I worked in, my research was with young people, which then also looks intersected with literature on ethnicity, race and ethnicity as well, so the subfield within sociology. And I think this is what has really influenced kind of the work that I'm doing in public administration as well. So my research was with racially minoritized young people and looking at sort of their transition into employment, so to speak, which is where my interest in youth studies came about as well. I think first of all, just to clarify, when I'm talking about race, it's just to say that it's a social construct, and in a racialized society like the UK, racially minoritized young people are sort of structurally positioned that puts them more at a disadvantage than many of the other white counterparts. And some of the intersecting crises, I'm going to give sort of two examples for that. You know, if we look at youth unemployment as a result of the pandemic, you know, they are most likely to be unemployed. And then when you think about the ethnic penalties in terms of discriminatory practices and all the different kind of social capital issues and living in deprived areas and things that race and ethnicity scholarship have talked about, you can see that actually they're also further disadvantaged because they're racially minoritized young people. Looking at COVID as well, it's also disproportionately affected Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities across the UK. So that's kind of like this kind of double whammy, if you like, for racially minoritized young people. And I think, you know, it's really important that we start to look at race not just as an additional thing that people explore in youth studies, but actually is one of the things. It's, you know, people talk about intersectionality all the time, but actually I think what what that allows us to think about really is who is most vulnerable, who are at the nexus of this kind of intersecting approach to disadvantage. What are the things that basically, make people more vulnerable? And I think we can't ignore race in the same way we can't ignore sexuality, ability, gender, class. You know, I liked what Ben talked about when he said the at risk, you know, that this at risk terminology that comes across, particularly when talking about, it comes across when talking about racially minoritized young people. You know, these are all racialized narratives. They're kind of loaded bias in the way that people talk about racially minoritized young people. And I think we really need to kind of unpack that when we are starting to do research about racially minoritized young people. Is thinking about, you know, what are some of the narratives that exist in these different spaces, whether that's in health, whether that's in education, whether that's in the criminal justice system. You know, what are people relying on when they're sort of deciding, making policy decisions or making research decisions? What are some of those assumptions that people have? And when you think about kind of racialization and how that works, it really kind of some of these social institutions that people assume as truth or as common sense understandings, while they may not be sort of explicit denigration of racially minoritized people, but actually they might be implicit understandings that are actually just not correct. Or, you know, and I came across that in my research where people assumed things about racially minoritized people and couldn't really get to the structural causes of some of these disadvantage. And I think this is something that youth studies need to really kind of engage with going forward. And a lot of, you know, what race and ethnicity scholars do is really that there's a lot kind of written on that. And I think if there's better engagement across all the different disciplines to actually, because what's happening is I think people kind of touch on it, but they don't sufficiently or explicitly draw on their scholarship, and which is so rich and diverse that I think youth studies can really kind of more, draw on that a bit more. And I think for me, in terms of, it's so important youth studies for me, because I think if you think about kind of disadvantage and how kind of disadvantage works is, you know, the sort of the functions between life choices and quality of life and how that works. And it's MacDonald et al. 2001, that classic thing about transitions, about how youth is the moment where actually life chances are established. So I think for me, this is the hope. I think youth studies, if they, you know, if race as a factor really starts to become central within the field, then actually we can start to think about strategies to interrupt the reproduction of injustices and, you know, interrupt this kind of reproduction of things that have just been going on and on and on because there's not been that explicit focus on it. And so for me, I think kind of to round up my own kind of introduction to the discussion would be that actually youth studies, when working with racialized, minoritized young people, is to center subjectivities, you know, to try and strip away some of these kind of hegemonic understandings of who they are as people, and to move away from, you know, if you have been in a society where you've been othered your whole life, the way that you think about your futures, the way you think about what's possible, you know, is impacted by all these kind of deterministic visions of your future. You think, oh, the most that can be is this, or, you know, and I think so for me, I think whatever research with racially minoritized people needs to also center racial literacy, to say, yes, you live in a racialized society, but again, I think Sophie was one who talked about agency, but, you know, how can we kind of equip you with some of these strategies to think about, yes, you still work within this kind of racialized society, but actually try and remove some of that sense of powerlessness, because that's what I came across in my in my research was trying to avoid or invoking that sense of non-agency or powerlessness, because that's not an ethical way to co-produce knowledge. So it's thinking about how do we really engage with their subjectivity so that we can kind of give them agency about, okay, what is it that I can do? What can I change? Or how can we kind of put pressure on the systems that need to change as well? I think that's kind of all I want to do with my panel, is just to encourage youth studies to think about how we put race at the center, sort of with all the things that we're studying, and thinking about how that impacts young people, and doing it in a way that kind of empowers them to imagine possible and radical utopian, however impossible, but to actually imagining is kind of the way forward, and it moves us closer to kind of a society where, and I am an optimist, but I'm a pragmatic optimist. So I know that we need to kind of, just imagine futures where actually it's possible that racially minoritized people aren't kind of at this nexus of oppression and vulnerability to oppression. That's me.
So thanks, Deo, and thanks for the introduction, Caitlin. So I obviously focus on drugs and young people's use of drugs in my research, and quite a lot of the things that have come up previously from Deo and from Sophie and Ben, particularly around understanding young people's kind of risky behaviours, and that's how often drug use is framed. So I guess thinking about how well or otherwise youth studies kind of engages with some of the other subdisciplines that I work in, which is particularly alcohol and drug studies, which is a kind of field in itself, criminology, and to a certain extent public health, or critical public health as well. So illegal drugs consumption among young people has kind of been quite a long-standing focus of sociology and criminology. So there's some kind of classic papers like Young's Drug Takers and Howard Becker's work around marijuana or cannabis use. So they kind of provide some of the kind of key readings for even contemporary scholars of young people's drug use. And actually within criminology as a kind of discipline that I'm often situated in, the focus tends to be amongst on young people's drug use around their interaction with drug laws, drug policies and their practices. But often criminology can be quite kind of preoccupied with the legal status or otherwise of drugs. So in terms of sociology, of youth sociology in particular, I think youth sociology is great at kind of capturing some of them sort of more cultural embodied experiences of intoxication. So there's a kind of slightly wider view, I feel, and that's really helpful. In terms of thinking about some of the theoretical viewpoints that the study of drugs takes from sociology and youth sociology, some of the most interesting work around using active network theory, actually, and also its critics, is exemplified by an Australian scholar, Dirk Frame, who writes about this idea of the kind of emergent event of youth drug use, and looks particularly at kind of different spaces and times. And I think that works really well. So some of the kind of theoretical, innovations in the field come from social theory and sociological theory. I think this has been mentioned before as well by the other speakers, that one of the strengths of sociology and youth studies, at least in my field in the engagement with criminology and alcohol and drug studies, is to kind of take age beyond the sort of category and just a crimogenic variable, which is how age sometimes gets talked about in relation to drug use. And so we can kind of focus on obviously transitions and the role of drugs and drug use in young people's transitions, in cultures, in their identities and their kind of self-regard, and then also in relation to kind of intersectional identities that they might have as well. So it kind of, youth sociology really kind of gives us an opportunity to move away from that kind of bracketing of the drug experience in terms of age, and kind of go towards the lived experience, which is really helpful. We've also talked, Deo in particular talked about the kind of more political activist, perhaps aspects of our scholarship, and I think youth studies again is really helpful in this regard, because partly because youth are often assumed to be very vulnerable to subversion. So that's kind of framed as peer pressure within very kind of non-critical approaches to youth drug use. So, and Ben talked about this in relation to kind of being perceived as at risk or risky. And so we need a kind of paternalist protection. And I think that also comes out in the kind of discussion about resilience and vulnerability that's kind of really vibrant in youth studies. So that's really helpful. The other thing is youth studies has a really strong interest in youth cultures, and obviously a lot of youth drug use, I say obviously, no, maybe not, a lot of youth drug use is related to music scenes and music cultures. And so youth studies is able to kind of question some of the more approaches that sort of criminalise and stigmatise youthful activities, and kind of take them as a kind of signal of some kind of problem, again, as Ben was talking about. So, I mean, obviously the kind of long-standing practice of young people dancing together is to kind of, I don't know, techno rave or something, is quite a classic one. The other thing that youth studies does is kind of foreground young people's voices as well. So in relation to their engagement with drug laws and drug policy, obviously because we live in a world where there's kind of global prohibition, then youth studies is great at kind of questioning some of those prohibition practices, such as the use of sniffer dogs in schools and at festivals, which actually, again, going back to Daya's point, impacts on racialised minorities more than other groups. So that's, again, something that's critical for youth studies around drug use. So I think actually youth studies is very successful in what it does in engaging with young people's drug use, and as a discipline it's really kind of helpful. I mean, we know that actually, at least in the UK, just focused on the UK, 16 to 24-year-olds past month and past year rate of powder cocaine and MDMA is actually higher compared to all other categories. And most drug possession offences in the UK actually involve young people disproportionately of minoritized ethnic heritage. Over 60% of those offences are around being caught with very small amounts of cannabis in public places. So that situation in terms of stop and search has actually worsened in the lockdown. And one of the things I think is really good about youth studies methodology is it takes those kind of quite difficult statistical snapshots and kind of enriches them in terms of using ethnographic detail, for example, to kind of understand how young drug takers view their experiences as well. So one of the other things relevant to the life course stream is that the youth studies and the notion of a kind of a career, a drug career. So drug career research has also been really useful in relation to using youth studies concept of the life course as well. So we've kind of borrowed in drug field, we've borrowed from various different kind of concepts, and that's particularly true of normalisation as well. So normalisation was an intervention from youth studies really, and the idea of differentiated normalisation, again an intervention from youth studies scholars around young people's drug taking, just pointing out that young people actually are all the same and they don't all just see drug use as the same thing. There's quite a lot of difference between groups of young people and also their drug taking. So I think that's a really kind of inspiring intervention in terms of using youth studies to kind of add nuance to alcohol and drug studies in that particular case. So yeah, in that sense, I'm really positive about the kind of future of the relationship between youth studies and, say, alcohol and drug studies. Yeah, just looking to the future really, and thinking that look, we've got a lot of work to do, but it's a kind of positive direction. Thanks, guys.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Sheldrick. I'm Professor of Inequalities at Newcastle University. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak and respond to the previous speakers in this session. I'm really sorry not to be there with everybody in person. The BSA conference is something I always really look forward to, and connecting up with friends old and new. So hopefully we'll be able to do that again in person before too long. Thanks to Caitlin for the introduction to this session, and also to the 4 speakers for their really insightful and thought-provoking contributions. I just want to speak very briefly about 3 issues, really. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the intersections of different types of inequality and how that impacts on young people's lives. I want to say something about the importance of the policy context, and also then at the end just to reflect very briefly on the current COVID context. So firstly, the intersections of inequality. I think this is a really important issue and a really important area. The youth studies field has generally been very good reporting on inequalities and reflecting on the lived experiences of young people. And those issues came through really, really strongly in all of the talks in this session earlier. And I think particularly Deo's description and Sophie's description of those intersections of inequalities was really, really important. Perhaps one of the areas we need to get better at is reflecting a little bit more on how those different dimensions of inequality intersect with each other. And that presents challenges for us all as youth researchers. We tend to focus on our particular areas or the particular things that we're interested in, and we sometimes feel a little bit cautious about venturing into different fields because we're not experts. And I think the youth field is really a very supportive space. So I think we have to work hard at trying to think about how these different intersections come together and how we can better understand those different intersections of inequality. If we don't do that, I think we risk fracturing the messages into being about a particular issue and not understanding how these different issues fit together. So one of the contributions that myself and colleagues made many years ago in the field of youth studies is around trying to understand youth transitions holistically. And I think that's something we might be able to learn a little bit that might help us to understand the different intersections and dimensions of inequality. In doing that, I think it's really important for us to think about how power and privilege is part of that conversation. And again, I think that's an area that we perhaps don't really pay enough attention to in youth studies. I also felt that in the talks, particularly Ben's and Karenza's, that the issues around the policy context and how we as youth researchers engage with that policy context. And sometimes we find it hard. Ben's comments on the risk concept and paradigms were really resonated with me, that sometimes in some contexts we're able to work with concepts really well, and others we shy away from because we want to have that kind of critical perspective that Karenza talked about. So I think we need to really engage more with policy, and I think it's an area that there is more work to be done, particularly as we kind of move through the pandemic and we think about those really important questions. Before the pandemic, it was very, very clear that young people were in a very difficult position, and we were already talking about those complex questions of intergenerational inequalities and how this particular younger generation are perhaps being disadvantaged in particular ways. And one of the things that I've been keen to talk about within those conversations is how inequalities between groups of young people are really important not to forget. So I guess the current context really gives us time for reflection, and I think Deo's point in thinking about imagined futures was something that really hit home with me. if we think back to just over a year ago, many of us couldn't imagine how much our lives would change and be impacted over the coming year. And we've also seen huge state intervention in the way people's lives might be supported. So I think there's a huge moment for reflection here, but we also know that inequalities, people from poorer backgrounds, young people are going to be particularly badly affected in the coming years after the pandemic. So suppose there is a moment here for us to be able to reflect. And I think, you know, maybe thinking about those intersections of inequality, reflecting on how things have changed and how things might change on the future might give us a platform to work collectively to try to improve the situation. There's lots of talk about going back to normal, and I think if we listen to some of the government rhetoric, it's very worrying that there is a rush, perhaps understandably, for people to want to get back to normal. But perhaps there is a moment here for us to reflect on some of those really important issues that have been raised in this session, but also to think about how we might work collectively within the discipline of youth studies in particular to take forward some of these debates. And I do think that leads us into that debate that was touched on earlier around activism and how far we're engaging in the political and the policy process. I think that's all I want to say, and I look forward to the discussion and questions that follow this session. Thank you.